Alien Discovery, an alien sci-fi romance by Ella Wayne. Chapter 1. Charles stepped through the door into his new quarters. I better not be assigned to the breeder program. He realized that was a very real possibility, but with his mind and abilities, breeding was the worst thing he could do to help his people. It would be a waste of time. The human women they found whose DNA was compatible enough to begin the breeding process were delicate and required time to woo. About that time, one of the breeders was led through one of the hallways 2 stories below. He could see her through the glass. She was tall, her long dark hair falling down her back in luscious waves. Her breasts were perky as she walked with dutiful purpose behind the scientist who led her. She wore the dress of his people, but in a pale shade of blue, a belt sinking it at the waist. She was perfection, even to the grim, his species. Even in her doll-like state, he could tell that she was a fighter. If only they could turn that inhibitor off and allow her personality to shine through, he wouldn't mind being a breeder, especially if he was assigned to her harem. But being in the breeding program would take time away from what he needed to focus on. Time they didn't have. Charles had been awakened by an alert telling him that someone was dangerously close to Base 8. His team was in charge of maintaining the security of this pod, but ultimately, he answered to someone who was in charge of the security of the entire base. Could it be that the had already discovered them? That they knew where Base 8 was located? Charles doubted it. It was probably somebody lost or looking for aliens. Glancing at the monitors at Derek's station, he saw a Volkswagen bus stop along the highway a couple of miles away, and a man and a woman got out. Alien hunters. Great. He readied the disorienting field generator just in case they got too close, and then continued to ignore them. He stepped to the console that contained all of his notes on the shield and growled. Marcus was an absolute slob and had left a mess everywhere. He was brilliant as long as his hands were moving, but as soon as those things stopped, it took everything in Charles not to kill him. With his console cleared of the American junk food Marcus had taken to love lately, he was able to work. They had a lot of problems. The most glaring one was that they were an alien race to this planet and were stranded. The wormhole gates had to be closed down because the were threatening to close in on them. They'd figured out a way to track the worm technology. And this world wasn't open to taking in aliens. They struggled with the idea of taking people from other countries, much less from another world. This world, these people, were filled with such hate. To be discovered here would mean the destruction or the enslavement of their race on the Earth station. His job was to ensure that Base 8 was never discovered. Joey walked in, a large burrito in his hand. "You eat yet?" Charles glared at the burrito. "You went out again to that burrito place." The food is amazing. Joey was tall, dark-skinned, and had long black hair. You also know better. As their assimilation expert, he should know that stealth and staying hidden meant keeping their people safe. Joey raised a dark eyebrow. You and I have different definitions of know better. We're supposed to be blending in. Part of that is showing up to places and being seen. They'd had this discussion before, and Charles still didn't agree. Their race was being threatened. They had no idea if the other planets had been successful or not. He had no idea if his little sister was okay on her new homeworld, for instance. Communications were down until they knew that the were no longer tracking them. Here on Earth, it seemed pretty evident that the were on their trail. "I take it the threat isn't imminent," Joey said. "Just tell me you didn't lead them right to us." Joey gave Charles a look that said he didn't, as he took another giant bite of his burrito, his cheeks bulging with food as he chewed. Why couldn't anyone on his team take this situation seriously? Joey didn't say another word as he took his seat at his station, looking at all the surveillance they had. Tourists. Obviously. Though that wasn't obvious. They'd been tricked into believing that before. The government was getting trickier and more devious, and they were getting better at locating them, using any method the Grimm could think of to hide. Just keep your eyes on them. Charles had to figure out a new way to keep Base 8 safe. That was his job. The base had motors and a star drive, though the drive would never be used to travel in space. It was meant to allow them to build their city however big they needed to and move it if they were discovered. That would be helpful because the people of Earth were not a trusting bunch, and it was hard to find places to hide, even in the desert of New Mexico. His current project was working on shields that would deflect the humans' newest radar they were developing. They had someone on the inside of some base, apparently. At least Charles assumed that because the information seemed solid. They were developing a technology humans shouldn't even be able to understand yet, unless they had a genius who could see beyond their current physical limits, and a genius like that hadn't been seen in a very long time. And that was what led Charles to believe the were closer to them than they'd hoped. Derek came in a little later, not saying a single thing. He was tall, well-built, and had long black hair as well, but his skin was pale. As head of security, he didn't have to say much. He just needed to speak when it was really necessary. Kirk burst into the room with a wild grin on his face, his curly brown hair looking like it hadn't been combed in a while, and his clothes rumpled. "I did it, and I have news." Charles turned to him in irritation. Kirk invented stuff, most of which didn't work the way he designed it. Did what? Got a message out and back? Kirk let out a whoop and then draped himself on Charles's large, flat console. As soon as his skin contacted the touchscreens, those screens went dark. Charles wanted to wring the man's neck, but if what he said was true... To home? No, but close. Zunis. Excitement flared in Charles's chest. That was the planet his sister had been relocated to. What did you hear? Well, only that they received the message, but this is great. It really was. As much as Charles hoped he could have gleaned just a little more information out of the man, that was at least something. And the can't track it? Kirk's grin widened as he shook his head. I've sent the plans to them. They're going to send them on to the other worlds, and soon our network should be up and operational. That was possibly some of the best news Charles had heard in weeks. Good. Now, go take a bath. You stink. Not quite so fast, Zapra Strognor said, as she strode into their room. She was tall, trim, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight braid down her back. She was their base commander and lead scientist. You will be having dinner in my dining hall tonight. That meant they were about to find out what their assignment was finally, or they were about to be assigned a breeding partner. Charles really hoped it was an assignment. He didn't agree with their breeding program. We'll be there, Charles said for the group. Zapra nodded in acknowledgement and then turned on her heel and left. She is one chilly woman, Joey muttered. That she was.
Kurt grinned, clapped Charles on the shoulder. I'll find Marcus and tell him the good news.
Thanks. Honestly, Charles couldn't figure out a reason why Zapra had collected the 5 of them together. They barely got along, and their pooled strengths and specialties didn't make a special project team list. At least, not one that he could fathom. Unless they were supposed to follow Kirk's lead and create some kind of tech that could help them fly under the cover. If that was the case, then, well, he was all for that. Charles was one of the brightest tacticians and leaders they had. Kirk was a brilliant inventor. Nothing ever got past Derek and his security. Marcus was amazing with his hands. He could build anything, no matter the state of the plans given to him. Joey, though. He was the oddball and the reason Charles, worried that they weren't going to be assigned to a task that would help their race, but to a breeder. Charles put it out of his mind and continued to work, running through the calculations and simulations on the modifications to the shield technology they already had in place. If he didn't find a way to modify what they already had, he was going to have to figure dump the current tech and replace it. That presented entirely new issues, like the lapse in time it would take to swap the two systems out. An hour slipped past, without Charles even realizing it, until another proximity alarm went off. He went to Derek's consoles and looked at what the cameras were picking up. The couple from earlier was practically headed right toward them. The woman carried some sort of device in her hand, and they were both looking around as if expecting to see something pretty specific. Charles pushed the button on the disorienting field. It didn't faze the two travelers at all. Alarm shot through Charles. Raise the alarm. He wasn't a soldier. It wasn't his job to go and collect the two humans. His job was to ensure someone else could. Within moments, Grimm soldiers surrounded the two humans. The lead Grimm brought out the knockout knob, as they'd begun calling it, and both humans slumped to the desert floor. "Come on," Charles told Derek, and they went down to holding. The man was in one holding cell and the woman was in the other, with the observation room in between. The observation room actually connected to 8 interrogation rooms, with large windows taking up all of the round wall space. Entry was gained through a lift in the floor. Charles studied them both. They seemed simple. But then again, most humans did. "I'm going in." No one ever entered an interrogation room. They hologrammed themselves into place, but the technology was so advanced that the person being interrogated generally thought they had a real person in there with them. He looked down at the driver's license the guards had pulled off of him. Eric Snyder. Charles chose the man first. His hologram appeared behind the man and he walked around the table to the other side. "What are you doing here?" Eric looked up at Charles, and a cold smile lanced his lips. So it's true. He really hated it when people played coy. "What's true?" Eric gestured to Charles with a wave of his hand. "All the fancy tech? You're not from this planet." What did Eric know? "Who are you working with?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" Eric sneered. He really would. "The government?" Eric rolled his eyes. "Is that the only person you could think of?" "No." "Then who?" Charles hoped he didn't hear the word roll off the man's tongue. Eric seemed to think about what he was going to say and then stopped himself. "I'm going to do you a favor." "Excellent. I'm going to tell you the God's honest truth." "Won't that be enlightening?" Eric nodded, studying Charles. "I'm here because my neighbor has gone missing. Again." And his missing neighbor brought Eric to Base 8? How? And how had they messed up? "She's been having this feeling like she's been kidnapped, and she keeps going on about being pregnant when she isn't." A breeder. This could potentially be bad. "I tracked you here," Eric said proudly. "Well, I tracked her here. I put a tracking device on her and then used the app thing. Whatever. It's on my phone, and that's how I know she's here." This could be disastrous, and it was something they hadn't thought of. "Charles," Derek said in Charles's earpiece, "we have to go. They can sit and stew for a bit." This was something he needed to bring to Zopra's attention anyway. Without another word, Charles disconnected the hologram signal. This was a problem, but largely because it was something they hadn't counted on. Someone actually cared about one of their breeders enough to put a tracking device on her, or one of the had figured out what they were doing and tracked one of the breeders down to track. Either way, was a disaster,